Greetings and salutations everyone, my name is Andrew Kirchhoff and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my week 3 waiver wire targets for the 2025 fantasy football season. Now every single Sunday, we always have to adapt to the new reality of the National Football League and what fantasy football presents, in the form of injuries with Joe Burrow, Aaron Jones, and now Jaden Daniels expected to miss week 3. Additionally, we have underwhelming performances in the form of players like Brian Thomas Jr., Tyrone Tracy. And then we have breakout stars in the form of someone like Skattebo, who is now expected to be the starting running back of the New York Giants for the remainder of the season. This was once seen as a competition in which Skattebo in due time would eventually take over, but the time has already arrived in week 2 of the 2025 season as Skattebo fully took over this backfield. So over the course of today, I'm going to be talking about players at a variety of different positions, the best available running backs, wide receivers, quarterbacks, tight ends, kickers, and defenses for this upcoming week. So let's go ahead and begin by talking about Skattebo. Again, like I mentioned, he fully took over this backfield in the matchup against the Dallas Cowboys in week 2, having played 19 of the last 31 snaps. But that's not the only statistic that he dominated within this backfield. In terms of overall rushing attempts, he had 11 in comparison to Tyrone Tracy's 5, 11 carries for 45 yards and a rushing touchdown for Skattebo. He had himself 3 targets and 2 receptions, having ran 1 less route than Tyrone Tracy. This fully looks like this is going to be Skattebo's backfield henceforth. And if that's going to be the case, currently only rostered in 73% of Sleeper League, 71% of ESPN formats. Again, he should have already been rostered in 100% of leagues because we knew that this time was eventually going to come. But again, if you have the opportunity of picking up Skattebo, be sure to do so as he is expected to be the starter of this backfield for the remainder of the season. Now, before I continue on by talking about the running back position and specifically some Jaguars, Falcons, etc., I'll be putting together a couple better plays for tonight's Monday night matchups as we have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers taking on the Houston Texans and the Los Angeles Chargers taking on the Raiders. If in fact any of those games present some value in terms of waiver wire pickups, I'll mention it on tomorrow's episode. But in regards to the potential of putting together some plays, I'll be going ahead and doing that at the end of today's episode. So for those of you who are interested, again, be sure to travel down to the description of the video and check out Betr. I'll be partnering with them for the entirety of the season, not only to present plays every single episode, but of course, provide rankings every single Sunday morning. For those of you who want my rankings, by position, by tier, half PPR, full PPR, all you have to do is sign up using code Andrew, make that first time deposit minimum of $10, and make a first time play minimum of $1 within a real cash play, picking more or less on 2-player statistics. Once you go ahead and complete all 3 of those steps, you'll be eligible to be on my email list and receive those emails every single Sunday for the remainder of the season. More information down below for those of you who are wondering. And of course, if you want to go ahead and make sure that you're eligible to take advantage of the opportunity, check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility based on your current location. And of course, new users who sign up today via Betr using code Andrew get a free $10. Thank you very much for all the support. All right, let's continue on with the running back conversation with TUTEN, the rookie running back that currently is only rostered in 45% of sleeper leagues, 40% of ESPN leagues. Again, these are players that we mentioned all offseason that should have already been rostered. But again, if you have the opportunity of picking them up, do yourself the favor because TUTEN is earning more opportunities within this backfield since the Tank Bigsby trade. Of course, Tank Bigsby last week traded to the Philadelphia Eagles, which evidently elevated Travis Etienne, but also TUTEN, as he is clearly now the number 2 running back. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, he has played 22 total snaps, 11 rushing attempts, and 2 total targets. Amongst all running backs in the National Football League thus far this season that have a minimum of 10 rushing attempts, he is 12th amongst all with a 4.8 yard per carry average, and he's number 8 amongst all running backs with 10 attempts minimum with a 3.91 yard after contact per attempt average. Even though Travis Etienne is still clear and away leading in terms of snaps, attempts, and efficiency in comparison to TUTEN, we know that Liam Cohen, the former offensive coordinator of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in 2024, liked to utilize both Rachaad White and Bucky Irving. There is a very good opportunity in which if TUTEN continues to prove that he is an effective part of this offense and should be on the field, he's coming off a performance in which he scored a receiving touchdown, got himself enough opportunity on the ground to be relevant in a close matchup. If they're going to utilize him in that capacity, not in blowout situations, of course, expect for his role to continue to expand and for him to potentially be a viable flex option in the coming weeks. The next player I wanted to mention is Tyler ALLGEIER. Look, he's playing far more than we anticipated. In terms of total rushing attempts, 10 in week 1 that led to 24 yards, an underwhelming performance, but in this most recent matchup, 16 rushing attempts in week 2 for 76 yards, and of course, the game-sealing touchdown at the end for 14.5 fantasy points. The fact that he has 26 rushing attempts in the first 2 weeks is scary for the potential of Bijan Robinson going forward, but even with that being the case, Bijan Robinson is still performing with the opportunities that he is being granted. So if Tyler ALLGEIER is going to survive outside of the shadow of Bijan Robinson and be a potential player that we can start in a given matchup. Why not this upcoming week taking on the Carolina Panthers? The Carolina Panthers matchup, again, as we all know, they can't stop the run, and as a defense, they really just can't stop anything in general. But when we talk about what Tyler Allgeier was able to accomplish against them in 2024, in week 6, 18 carries for 105 and a touchdown for 19.8 fantasy points. In week 18, in that matchup, 9 carries for 52, 2 catches for 17, still scored 8.9 fantasy points and a half PPR. There's a lot of potential in which Tyler Allgeier could very easily be a top 36 option this week against the Carolina Panthers. Now, again, the first 3 running backs that I just mentioned are all handcuffs and should have already all been rostered. In terms of sleeper formats, we're talking about 73, 45, and 33% for these 3 individual running backs. So while we're still on the topic of potentially picking up a player that is a handcuff that is going to have more value in the future, let's continue on with TYJAE Spears, who, yes, is still currently dealing with the injury of the high ankle sprain that he sustained this offseason during the preseason, but in specific, he's on the IR. If he's available in your league, as of right now, currently only rostered in 35% of sleeper leagues, 30% of ESPN leagues, if you want to go ahead and fill in your IR spot, if in fact you don't already have a player within that position, be sure to pick up TYJAE Spears, because once he does return, he is going to be fantasy relevant. We've talked about it in the past. Even with him and Tony Pollard functioning within this backfield, he is the preferred receiving back, and in the event in which anything happens to Tony Pollard, he'd have the full workload reign of this backfield, in which he showed last season. In the absence of Tony Pollard, he is easily a top 30 option on a given weekly basis. Then we continue on with another handcuff option, which is Blake Corum. Now again, Blake Corum obviously was able to get himself a lot of workload because of the lead that this team was able to amass against the Tennessee Titans, but he looked really good. I mean, 3 of his overall rushing attempts led to 9, 15, and 15 yards. Obviously scored a touchdown on a 1-yard plunge in which they were able to get him into the end zone for his first career touchdown as a Los Angeles Ram. But as we continue on, if the Los Angeles Rams are going to continue to find success on the ground, why not go ahead and split up and divvy up some of the opportunities in order to keep Kyren Williams fresh, as we have a 2-headed monster within this backfield. And then we have DJ Giddens, who as of right now, we all know what Jonathan Taylor's career injury history looks like. And if in fact we want to go ahead and ensure that policy, make sure that if you have Jonathan Taylor, Giddens is on roster just in case, not only as a handcuff option, but someone that, again, in due time, as they take on the Tennessee Titans this week, there could be a lot of garbage time upside in terms of rushing attempts, very similar to week 1 for Giddens. All right, let's continue on with the wide receiver conversation. We have Wan'Dale Robinson, who, like I mentioned earlier this offseason, and I'll once again reiterate, just like I did last week, over the course of 2019 to 2024, wide receivers who have had 140 targets within a given season, unless they were injured or, of course, missed time due to a suspension in the following year, they are not eligible. But all wide receivers who stayed healthy in the following year after getting 140 targets had a minimum of 110 targets the following season. Obviously, we all know that Wan'Dale Robinson was a surprise having 140 targets in 2024. But going into this year, we're expecting 110 targets minimum. And based on what we have seen in the first 2 weeks of the season, 18 total targets thus far in the first 2 games. 8 in week 1, which led to 6 catches, 55, and 8.5 fantasy points and a half PPR. And 10 targets for 8 catches and 142 and a touchdown for 24.2 fantasy points in week 2. Of course, Russell Wilson doing a lot of favors for Wan'Dale Robinson and Malik Neighbors. He threw a couple, interesting arm punts at the end of that game, but nonetheless, the opportunity share is there for Wan'Dale Robinson within an offense that is always going to be implicated for negative game scripts. Over the course of the first 2 weeks, being able to garner a 25% target rate while playing 70% of the offensive snaps. Of course, he needs to be on roster. There's a reason why we mentioned him last week in terms of the waiver wire pickups. If you did yourself the favor, congratulations. Otherwise, currently still available in 70+% of leagues, whether it be Sleeper or ESPN. Troy Franklin is the next wide receiver I wanted to mention. Currently only rostered in 8% of Sleeper leagues, 2% of ESPN leagues. If you have an opportunity of picking up Troy Franklin, I think you should be able to take advantage of that, because we already know that Troy Franklin is a former Oregon Duck and a primary receiving option of Bo Nix back in college. Again, he had 1,300 yards in the final season at Oregon with Bo Nix. So if we're going to be in a position in which Troy Franklin is going to continue to adapt and continue to evolve his game and become the number 2 receiving option of the Denver Broncos offense, of course, we want to pay attention because we know how high-powered that offense can potentially be. Now, in week 1, Troy Franklin was exposed to 6 targets of opportunity for 4 catches, 44 yards. But in week 2, took a huge jump. 9 targets, 8 catches, 89, and scoring a receiving touchdown for 20.0 fantasy points. This entire offseason, we've all speculated regarding who's going to be the number 2 of this offense. And of course, we know that Courtland Sutton will be the number 1 option, but we were wondering, is Marvin Mims going to continue his success? Are they bringing in guys like Evan Ingram and RJ Harvey to be the joker role and the number 2 receiving option of the Denver Broncos? And we all missed it. Troy Franklin in plain sight, hiding in plain sight, coming away with a 27% target rate in the first 2 weeks and a 70% snap share. If he's exclusively going to continue to play like he has thus far this season on 2 wide receiver sets and 3 wide receiver sets like he did in week 2, then I expect him to be the starting wide receiver of this offense and be incredibly valuable going forward, as we know that PENIX is going to continue to play well. Obviously, they weren't able to come away with a victory in week 2 against the Colts, but we all know just how good this offense can be based on what they demonstrated last year, and if Troy Franklin's just going to get a piece of that, of course, we want to pick him up for the remainder of the season. The next player I wanted to mention is ELIC, AYOMANOR. Now, as of right now, I mentioned him as a hidden gem, and I think he was the only hidden gem to hit in week 1, but he was able to score himself kind of a lucky touchdown of sorts, having came away with 13 targets in the last 2 weeks in comparison to Calvin Ridley having 14. That is incredibly promising. So even though this most recent week still scored 13.6 fantasy points, 6 targets, 4 catches, 56 and a touchdown, what is truly most important for AYOMANOR for the remainder of the season is target opportunity. And he has certainly gotten that within this offense. So if that continues to stay consistent, as he is the number 2 receiving option clear and away, again, I expect him to continue to adapt his game and continue to evolve. Amongst all wide receivers as of right now, he has 202 air yards, which ranks 13th at the position. With the Titans implicated for negative game scripts for the remainder of the season, this day 3 rookie has a lot of opportunity on hand and, of course, can immediately be fantasy relevant in the short term and hopefully for the remainder of the season. The next player I wanted to mention is ROMEO DOUBS, currently rostered in 23% of sleeper leagues, 20% of ESPN leagues. Again, with Jaden Reed now going down with injury, Christian Watson still recovering from the ACL last year and still trying to recover and get back to being at 100% so he can play. In the absence of these receiving, competition threats, ROMEO DOUBS technically is the number 1. But Jordan spreads the love within the Green Bay Packers offense. We know that. So it's not really like, oh, because these other receivers are out, ROMEO DOUBS is immediately guaranteed to see himself 8 to 10 targets per week. That's not how this Green Bay Packers offense functions, nor is that how it's going to function. There's a reason why in the last 2 weeks we have seen only 4 in 5 targets in the direction of ROMEO DOUBS. Yes, he has scored 7.8 and 10.3 half PPR fantasy points within those efforts, which is very promising, but again, it makes him a very difficult play unless you're playing in an incredibly deep league. Over the course of 2024, in games in which he was given 4 to 6 targets, 11.26 fantasy points per game. He doesn't require much opportunity share, but when he is given said opportunities, he has been incredibly effective over the years, and we're hoping that, again, this high-powered offense is going to continue to slice through defenses. Taking on Cleveland this week should be able to set up someone like ROMEO DOUBS for a lot of success in the short term. The next 2 players I wanted to mention are Hunter Renfrow and Jalen Coker. The primary reason why I want to mention both of these players in the same singular panel is because Hunter Renfrow is coming off of a game of 9 targets, 7 catches, 42, and 2 receiving yards for 20.3 fantasy points, in which, while they were down, 20 points in the final 7 minutes of the game, the Carolina Panthers were able to roar back and try to put up some sort of a fight and at least pick up a lot of garbage time fantasy points. Now, again, if Hunter Renfrow in the short term, until the return of Jalen Coker, is going to be the comfort target of Bryce Young, then of course he's going to be of value and someone that we can pick up and fire up within the upcoming weeks, which is until the return of Jalen Coker. Jalen Coker is currently on the IR, again, dealing with an injury. The expectation is that he should return in week 5. And the expectation was that he was going to play within the primary slot receiving role. And there's a reason why that they cut Hunter Renfrow after trading away Adam Thielen. Therefore, you can utilize Hunter Renfrow in the meanwhile as they take on the Atlanta Falcons this week. Should be a high-scoring back-and-forth matchup. But in the following weeks to come, pick up Jalen Coker, put him on your IR next to TYJAE Spears, like I mentioned earlier, and have both of these be contributors within your roster for the remainder of the season. All right, let's continue on with the tight end conversation really quickly. If somehow, some way, these 3 tight ends that I'm about to mention are available in your league, please do yourself the favor and pick them up, because somehow, some way, Zach Ertz still only rostered in 53% of sleeper leagues, 50% of ESPN leagues. Again, he's the number 2 overall tight end thus far this season, having put up 10.1 and 15.4 half PPR fantasy points in the first 2 weeks. To close out the 2024 season from weeks 7 through 18, was averaging 5.6 targets per game and 9.92 fantasy points per game. Now, I understand this week he will not have Jaden Daniels most likely. It'll be Marcus Mariota, but I'm still expecting for the remainder of the season, Zach Ertz, as long as he can stay healthy, to be relevant. Then we move on to JUWAN Johnson, who was the number 1 tight end pickup of last week. Currently rostered in 50 and 48% of leagues, of course on Sleeper and ESPN. He's the number 3 overall tight end in fantasy thus far, having put up 11.6 and 13.4 fantasy points and a half PPR. Over the course of the last 4 games he has played with Spencer Rattler. The first 2 games of this season and the final 2 games of the 2024 season, he has accumulated 37 targets and is averaging 11.4 fantasy points per game. And for fantasy purposes, Rattler has been a beautiful sight to see in the last couple weeks here. Then we move on to Harold Fannin Jr., who again is another member that many of us picked up last week, currently rostered in 66% of sleeper leagues, 28% of ESPN leagues. If Harold Fannin is available, he's currently the number 8 overall ranked tight end this season. He's number 3 amongst all tight ends in terms of total receptions, and he's playing as the primary slot receiving option of the Cleveland Browns. The Browns don't have a solidified number 3 receiver. They have Judy, they have Cedric Tillman, they have their tight end, which is going to be Njoku, and Harold Fannin is functioning as their slot receiving option, having ran 56% of his routes from the slot position thus far this season, and accumulating 50% of his receptions and 53% of his receiving yards from the slot. So again, as long as that opportunity continues to stay consistent, absolutely needs to be a pickup for the remainder of the season. The final tight end I wanted to mention is Ja'Tavion Sanders, who is coming off of a week in which he had 9 targets, 7 catches, and 54 yards. I understand that as a blocker, he's not the greatest, but he's going to maintain on the field as a receiving threat, which we all witnessed in 2024, having averaged 1.32 fantasy points per target in that season. Thus far this season, again, hasn't been exposed to a greater opportunity share outside of week 2. In week 1, it was relatively quiet for him. But when we talk about the potential of more targets going in his direction because of how he performed, I mean, when we look back to 2024, in games in which he had 5 to 7 targets, was averaging 7 fantasy points per game. He's coming off of weeks in which he played 60+% of the snaps. If that number can continue to increase to 70, 80%, of course, Ja'Tavion Sanders will continue to grow in terms of fantasy relevancy. The next player I wanted to mention is Daniel Jones. We talked about him last week. We'll continue to harp on his success. For those of you who are needing to replace Toe Burrow, I expect Daniel Jones to be the answer. Of course, they're coming off of a 2-0 hot start. Really quickly, just to put it out there, the Indianapolis Colts, they set a record in weeks 1 and 2. They're the first team in NFL history to not punt a single time in the first 2 weeks. Now, I understand they had a punt and there was a penalty, and it led to a first down, but they technically haven't punted once this season. And if Daniel Jones is going to continue to lead the charge, having scored 29 and 22 fantasy points in the last 2 games, having scored 3 rushing touchdowns, he's incredibly relevant. He looks fantastic. And having beaten the Denver Broncos, it makes me incredibly excited for his potential against Tennessee this week. Michael Penix is our number 2. Look, as of right now, currently rostered in 43% of leagues. If you picked him up and you potentially held him for last night's game, he obviously didn't play up to par, but I do expect a bounce back performance here against the Carolina Panthers. For those of you who have Jaden Daniels, Joe Burrow, and potentially other quarterbacks that you're not too satisfied with, I think Michael Penix taking on Carolina can certainly be a matchup where we should be firing him up. Now that you have Darnell Mooney with another week, it should be able to at least give us a little bit more potential for upside. The final quarterback I wanted to mention is Jake Browning, primarily because, again, with Toe Burrow out, Jake Browning is going to be the immediate backup. He's coming off of a game in which, again, he did throw 3 interceptions, but still was relevant with 3 total touchdowns scored, 2 through the air, 1 on the ground. In 6 of the last 7 games in which Jake Browning has started for this team, he has scored 2 or more touchdowns. In 2023, from weeks 13 through 18, was averaging 20.15 fantasy points per game in a 4-point per passing touchdown league in the absence of Toe Burrow. So going forward, I'd anticipate that Jake Browning immediately relevant, unless, of course, the Bengals want to go about, trading for someone like Jameis Winston in the coming weeks. We'll have to wait and see. All right, let's continue on with the kicker and defensive conversation with Spencer SHRADER. Like I mentioned just moments ago with Daniel Jones. Again, Daniel Jones and the Colts offense have not punted this season at all. Now, I don't expect that streak to continue, yet Spencer SHRADER is technically the number 1 kicker in fantasy, and having put up 16 and 18 fantasy points in the last 2 games, we should probably pay attention to that and probably fire him up as they take on the Tennessee Titans this week. Now, speaking of the Tennessee Titans, let's talk about Joey SLYE, the number 2 kicker in fantasy. Both of these kickers ahead of Brandon Aubrey in terms of total fantasy points thus far this season, as Joey SLYE has put up 15 and 17 points in the last 2 games. He has scored 8 of his last 8 field goals. And of course, this team has been relatively competitive against the Rams and Broncos. And in the late stages of these games, yes, the opposing team pulls away. But if they're going to be at home, Joey SLYE's feeling comfortable, they're continuing to kick field goals, of course, we want to pick him up and potentially fire him up. The final kicker I wanted to mention is Parker Romo. This is John Parker Romo from last year, who filled in for Will Reichard of the Minnesota Vikings last season. If you guys remember, when the Vikings picked him up in the 4-game streak in which he played with them, he scored 13 points in 3 of the 4 games. Thus far in his NFL career, as a member of course, the Atlanta Falcons, having put up 18 points, scored 5 of 5 field goals. If the Falcons taking on the Carolina Panthers is going to be a high-scoring matchup in the favor of the Falcons, of course, expect Parker Romo to get himself a lot of looks. Then we move on to the defensive conversation, which we begin with the Green Bay Packers, currently rostered in 54% of sleeper leagues. Again, if they are available, pick them up. They take on Cleveland this week. Again, the Browns have allowed 7.0 and 16.0 fantasy points from opposing defenses in the last 2 games, and the Packers have been able to shut down the Washington Commanders and Detroit Lions, so I would expect them to be able to handle the Cleveland Browns. Then we move on to the Indianapolis Colts, only rostered in 7% of leagues, but they play against Tennessee. and the Tennessee Titans have allowed 16.0 and 9.0 fantasy points to the Broncos and Rams defense in the last 2 weeks, so why not the Colts? Then we move on to the Seattle Seahawks, who take on the New Orleans Saints. The Saints have allowed 5.0 and 7.0 fantasy points in the last 2 weeks to the Cardinals and 49ers defense. But the Seahawks defense as a whole, in the last 2 weeks, 8.0 and 14.0. And if we want to exclude the unfortunate Caleb Johnson situation where he literally just gave up a free touchdown in that game, they would have at least scored 8 points in each of the last 2 games as a defense. And I would expect them to potentially, hopefully, produce very similar numbers within the upcoming matchup against the New Orleans Saints. The final defense I wanted to mention as an honorable mention is the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, primarily because they take on the New York Jets, and in the event in which Justin Fields is going to be out with the concussion protocol, probably want to look in the direction of picking on this defense in order to fire them up against Tyrod Taylor. Could be something of a treat for many of us in the fantasy realm who play with kickers and defenses. All right, that's going to cover it for me today in regards to potential waiver wire pickups. Again, if any members of tonight's games between the Chargers and Raiders, and of course Tampa Bay Buccaneers or Houston Texans become relevant fantasy options, I will mention them on tomorrow's episode and of course tomorrow's live stream, in which I'll be talking about all waiver wire pickups. Until then, let's go ahead and let's transition into talking about some potential plays for the Monday night games between the teams that I mentioned, and let's try to get back on track with a hot streak with some great plays via Betr. Let's check that out right now. All right, so when I travel on over to Betr today, I want to take advantage of 2 specific plays. First and foremost, I think Nico Collins' week 1 performance again is not something that is going to continue. Therefore, you can already tell I've taken more on 3.5 receptions. Nico Collins has been able to surpass this number in 11 of the last 13 full games in which he has played in his career. Again, this most recent week only had 3 receptions. I doubt that against this defense of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who just gave up 8+ catches to Drake London in week 1, is not going to be able to get diced up by someone like Nico Collins. Again, he currently has a nuclear play of an anytime touchdown. I honestly don't even mind that as a potential play if I was going to put less cheddar on the overall play. Now, another player that I would like to pair up with someone like Nico Collins is Jakobi Meyers. Now, in the case of Jakobi Meyers, since Davante Adams has left the Raiders, 12 of those last 13 games consisting of 4 or more receptions. Therefore, I will take both of these players. So I've gone ahead and I've put together a play in regards to these 2 players. As you guys can see in the top left, and I'll zoom in here, it's a $100 play in order to go ahead and for Nico Collins to go more than, his 3.5 receptions, and someone like Jakobi Meyers to go for more than 3.5 of his receptions. Again, these are the number ones of their offenses, implicated for a high-scoring game, hopefully for both their situations. I expect both these plays to be great as we go into this upcoming week. Now, the rest of the plays that you guys can see on screen are for like the full season plays. I mean, these are, again, like guys like Alvin Kamara and DK Metcalf surpassing their reception totals for this year. But in regards to week 2 Monday night plays, these are the 2 players that I like to go ahead and fire up. Again, if there are other players that you may want to potentially go after, again, be sure to go ahead, check out Betr today, use code Andrew. And when you sign up using code Andrew, making that first time deposit minimum of $10 and making that first time play minimum of $1, you'll go ahead and be eligible to get my rankings every single Sunday morning to help you set your lineups every single week of the remainder of the season. So for those of you interested, check that out down below. Again, that's going to cover it for me today. Best of luck on your upcoming matchups. Hopefully you can pull together some victories here, put together some victories via the Betr plays that we make. And until tomorrow, where we'll be talking about my top 36 running backs, I'll see you guys. Peace.